Welcome back to the 5 leaders of the Great Transition. Again, I'm Annie Browning, and I'm grateful for this time to connect with you. Today, we're going to be venturing into exploring the realm of the visionary, the innovator, the one who actually sees beyond the horizon, which is our pathway pioneer. And I want to start by saying that the reason that we are leaning into these archetypes is because in times of great transition and uncertainty, many facets of our identity begins to shift and fall away. And as we're in that middle space, a space that we're often not very comfortable with, that is highly, unknown, and we're not quite sure where we're going and even who we are anymore, these classic archetypes can serve as essentially a conduit, even an artistic expression for us, a creative opportunity to begin to move from one way of being into what is awaiting us. And that is why we are focusing on these archetypes together. So, as we consider the pathway pioneer, I want to start with a question that I invite you to actually feel deeply within your heart. And the question is, what if the future that you are planning on, that you have carefully crafted and constructed in your experience, is based on assumptions that are already obsolete? What if the pathway forward is actually about letting go of everything that you think of in terms of how things work? I know it's a little scary to think that way. I want to begin with a story that actually just happened this week. I've been working on a project that uses AI to enhance collective consciousness, our capacity or our sense of connection with one another. And as you know, it's one of those ventures that I thought I had everything mapped out. I knew my timelines, and I felt like I had my plan locked down. And I was so focused on this carefully constructed roadmap that I almost missed what the universe was telling to me. I noticed that we had a number of new participants that were joining, and they were indicating that English was their second language. Honestly, if I'm candid, I didn't think too much about it. I was operating from my own cultural bias, assuming that everyone would just adopt to an English-centered approach. Then just last week at 4:30 in the morning, I woke up with a jolt. And I mean, literally, something had shaken me awake. I could hear multiple languages flooding through my consciousness, ones that I did not understand. It sounded like Spanish, Mandarin, Arabic. This cascade of human voices was coming in literally through my ears, trying to connect with me. So I immediately jotted down a few notes. And the very next morning, I called the programmer that's working on this larger project. And I said, we need to explore AI translation now, not a year from now, as I had planned, but now. What I realized was the future has been whispering me through those English as a second language comments, but I wasn't sensitive enough to hear it. And I was so immersed in my own bias about what I thought needed to happen that it took that 4:30 a.m. download for me to understand that true collective consciousness cannot emerge when we're limiting it to one language. The pathway wanted to include everyone from the beginning, not just those who happen to speak my native tongue. I offer this story because this is how pathway pioneer consciousness works. Sometimes the future has to shake us awake when we're so attached to our existing plans to notice what is actually trying to emerge. There's a great futurist, John Shar, who wrote that the future is not some place we are going, but one we are creating. The paths are not to be found, but made, and the activity of making them changes both the maker and the destination. This captures the essence of the pathway pioneer, that leader who doesn't just adapt to changes, but senses and responds to possibilities that don't yet exist in any visible form. They navigate by stars that haven't yet appeared in the sky. So we are in this time of great transition, this exponential change and a paradigm breakdown, and our conventional planning becomes quickly inadequate. Not just inadequate, but in the case of my own story, potentially harmful. The maps that we are using are drawn for territories that no longer exist. And here's what I know from my own life and from looking at innovators that I both admire and aspire to be in my own life. The most significant transformations come from those who are willing to venture beyond the edges of our current maps. So let me share a story with you, a classic perennial consciousness story that helps us understand the consciousness of the pathway pioneer. For over 1,000 years, Polynesian navigators crossed vast stretches of the Pacific Ocean that used no instruments except their finely tuned awareness. They developed what they called feeling the island, a capacity to sense the presence of land beyond the horizon through subtle changes in wave patterns, cloud formation, and bird behavior. These wayfinders could detect islands up to 50 miles away using skills that modern science is only beginning to understand. They integrated empirical observation with intuitive sensing, inherited wisdom with present moment attunement to venture successfully into unknown territory. What made these navigators archetypal pathway pioneers wasn't courage, though that, of course, is essential, but their integration of multiple ways of knowing. They demonstrated that breakthrough navigation requires expanding beyond those conventional stories and sensory and cognitive limitations to access that wider intelligence that emerges through a relationship with the living world. Contemporary pathway pioneers are using similar integration, both rational analysis, intuitive perception, pattern recognition, and systems sensing to navigate the uncharted waters of this global transition. We know that in Norse mythology, Odin was the All-Father. He sacrificed his eye for wisdom and hung it on the world tree for 9 days and nights to gain knowledge of the runes, a fundamental pattern to underlie reality. And this great Norse quest illumines for us that we often need to sacrifice and perhaps suffer, not for suffering's sake, but suffer a willingness to venture beyond what we know. And that requires the greatest courage of all. To venture beyond the wisdom of what we think we know, to sacrifice our familiar ways of seeing to perceive entirely new dimensions of reality. So right now, I'm in this very moment, I'm living into this sacrificial suffering. Again, it's not a call to sacrifice or suffer out of an old paradigm of victimhood or martyrdom, but to let go of what we think we know. And right now, for weeks, my left ear has been pulsing, this persistent rhythmic sensation that my rational mind wants to dismiss as a medical issue. And yet I know, of course, from the wisdom of my own body, and I encourage you to consider the wisdom of your own body right now, is that my body is telling me something that I need to pay attention to, especially when it is this insistent. And what I'm sensing is that the information is coming through the feminine, the receptive, intuitive, relational intelligence that's trying to break through the noise of my own predominantly masculine identity and action-oriented way of being. But here's the thing. To receive this transmission, you and me, we have to do what Odin did. I have to sacrifice my attachment to what I think I should be hearing. All of our minds want strategic insights, clear action steps, measurable outcomes. This pulsing in my ear is asking me to let go of the familiar frameworks entirely, to dwell in that space between knowing and not knowing, to understand that wisdom wants to emerge beyond any category I currently understand. It's uncomfortable. There's the part of me that just wants it to go away. But I've learned that when there is persistent bodily knowing, it is signaling that we are on the threshold of perceiving something essential that our current paradigm can't access. Odin's myth exemplifies that breakthrough requires us to leave behind the safety of known territory, to literally hang between heaven and earth, belonging to fully neither one. The liminal position is what provides access to insights that are unavailable between any particular perspective. So let's ground our conversation in some neuroscience of future sensing. So some contemporary research by Dr. Daniel Schachter's work at Harvard envisions that future scenarios involve the same neural networks that we use to recall past experiences. This mental time travel that often occurs when we are in a time distortion, when our sense of time is altered, it allows us to simulate future possibilities and make decisions based on projected outcomes. And many people do exhibit what researchers call, focusing illusion. We overweight present circumstances and underestimate how much change is actually possible. And so pathway pioneers, and you have this archetype within you, demonstrate an unusual capacity for what scientists call perspective thinking, accurately envisioning scenarios that differ significantly from our current conditions. When we have future-oriented cognition, it is an integrative mechanism between the hippocampus for memory and scenario reconstruction, the prefrontal cortex for planning, and the posterior cingulate for perspective taking. This isn't just mystical, it's measurable. And our ability to become a pathway pioneer means that we have developed neural integration that all of us can access. Here's a bit more research for you to ground our conversation. Research from the Santa Fe Institute illumines for us that something profound can happen when we are at the edge of chaos. And I've referenced this before in our podcast, and I'm repeating it again because it is so important. Complex adaptive systems, from our ecosystems to our economies, demonstrate maximum creativity and adaptation when we are living at the edge of chaos. Literally, when we are at the edge between rigid order and random chaos is where new patterns emerge. So too much order can prevent adaptation. Too much chaos can prevent coherent organization. But right at that edge between the liminal space of structure and of flow, transformation becomes possible. So many of you have heard me recount before that living at the edge of this chaos, often in unexpected and unpredictable ways, has been beneficial for innovation. And in particular, the gaze method that I've developed came through at that edge of chaos. I have always valued on keeping a certain modicum of control in my meditative practice. If I'm honest, I'm a bit of a meditation perfectionist. I've always studied all the techniques. I've had them down. I knew which postures to use, my breathing patterns to regulate, and I could drop into a focused state on command. And I honestly felt pretty accomplished about my spiritual discipline. And then, of course, after our son's death, everything was off kilter. And during meditation in particular, instead of that calm, controlled, focused awareness that I was cultivating, I began to experience many spontaneous expansions of consciousness that I could not control. And it began to shift into something more fluid and unpredictable. At first, I fought it. I wanted to bring my meditation back under control using focused awareness techniques, stabilizing my attention so that it felt more safe and comfortable. But the more I resisted, the more chaotic my inner experience became. I was caught between that rigid order of traditional practice and the complete chaos of uncontrolled consciousness. And that's where the gaze method was born. At that true edge of chaos, in that liminal space where I had to let go of controlling my meditation and trusting whatever was emerging, that's where I discovered many of the patterns that are used in the gaze method. In particular, it was to get at that zone between control and chaos, to sense into possibilities that I could not predetermine and to allow emergent intelligence to move through me. And I want to pause and say that this is the exact zone that the gaze method facilitates. You stay in control with self-agency of your process, but you lean into the chaos of what is uncontrolled, right in that beautiful space in between. And what happens is there is that parallel of freedom and expanded awareness that comes together in a beautiful cacophony of experience. The gaze method emerged in my own experience from learning to navigate that edge between surrender and flow, between intention and letting go. Pathway pioneers navigate this edge of chaos zone. They understand that breakthrough innovation requires releasing our grip on unexpected methods, trusting the intelligence that wants to emerge. And sometimes the most pioneering thing we can do is stop trying to pioneer and allow ourselves to be pioneered by life itself. So every archetype that we've talked about so far does have a shadow, and the pathway pioneer has some unique challenges. Sometimes we know how we are resonating with an archetype by its shadow more than its characteristics. So as you listen to these qualities of the shadow, you may notice where, there are some mirrors that are being reflected in your own life. And certainly, innovators and visionaries can become so addicted to novelty or so future focused that there can be a loss of connection with present reality. So the shadow of the pathway pioneer often includes a reckless innovation that can ignore practical constraints, chronic dissatisfaction with present circumstances, isolation from community and accountability, vision without implementation, and spiritual bypassing of the necessary groundwork. And the antidote for all of us who have the pioneer within us, the pathway pioneer, is that when we are grounded in our visioning, we maintain connection to both emerging possibilities and current realities, both innovation and implementation, personal vision and collective needs. So let me offer to you an emergent possibility practice, a very short 3-step practice that you can use to develop your ability to sense what wants to emerge beyond circumstances. So first of all, choose a domain that you care about, your work, a community, a global challenge, and notice some current information of what you know about trends and also emerging developments. Secondly, enter an expanded awareness, and you can do that using just one small piece of the gaze method, which is to take a few deep breaths. You can close your eyes or keep them open, and then you shift your gaze forward, far, and wide. Allow the mind to quiet. You can always do that through breath, especially focusing on expanding and extending the exhale of your breath. And allow your perception to shift beyond the immediacy of what you know about this part of your life. From this expanded state, forward far and wide in terms of your gaze, notice responses to these questions. What may want to happen over the next 10 to 20 years in your domain? What possibilities are emerging that aren't yet widely recognized? What would it look like if you moved beyond current limitations? Notice your energetic experience. Notice what's happening in your body. Pay attention to what scenarios may have popped forward in your awareness from your current perspective, and that somehow might be part of the inevitability of what is expanding in your consciousness, what is guiding you forward. In the Buddhist tradition, one who has reached enlightenment but delays entering nirvana helps all beings achieve liberation. And this perfectly describes the authentic pathway pioneer. They work toward possibilities that may not be realized within their lifetimes. They plant seeds for forests that may not be fully grown. They create structures and foundations that others may complete. So let's go back to my original story about the collective consciousness project I'm working on, the one that woke me up at 4:30, demanding multilingual capacity. It is something that I fully expect to exceed my lifetime. Why? Because it's about collective consciousness. It likely will take decades for something to mature. To build an infrastructure for collective consciousness that a future generation may recognize means that there will be an indwelling, an inhabitation, and a development that will be beyond anything I can envision. I hope you can hear my words as your words, as deeply humbling about engaging in the kind of work where the goal is to go beyond. What this means is that you and me and we, as pathway pioneers, are invited to spend days dreaming into frameworks for human connection that will reach full potential long after you and me and we are gone. It's acknowledging that there is just one small piece of a larger puzzle that countless others will solve. And the fulfillment comes from not seeing the final outcome. It comes from knowing that each small contribution, each line that we create, each insight, each experiment plants seeds in a possible field of possibility for our own species. So I invite you to consider in this moment what seeds are calling to you that you may never see grown. What long-term vision is beckoning you, even though you may just contribute to one small piece. In a concrete way, maybe you are a teacher who's developing a curriculum for students that will come to fruition decades from now. Perhaps you're a parent raising a child who will change a world that you can barely imagine. You may be an activist working on a social change that could take generations to fully manifest, or an artist who creates a lovely work that will influence people that you've never met. Our willingness to work for the collective rather than individual benefit, combined with patience to engage in a long-term evolutionary process, is the consciousness that drives the pathway pioneer. It's the difference between entrepreneurship that serves the ego and pathway pioneering that serves evolution itself. The mystic poet Rilke wrote, "The only journey is the one within." And I add, the journey within reveals pathways that serve the journey of all. Pathway pioneers serve additional and essential functions during our great transition. They venture beyond current paradigms to sense and respond to emergent possibilities. They integrate multiple ways of knowing and remain comfortable with uncertainty. They align their efforts with evolutionary forces to create innovations that serve a collective transformation. How are you called to pioneer new possibilities? What emergent future is calling to you? Because pathway pioneers understand what we may call cathedral consciousness, the willingness to work on projects not completed during lifetimes, building structures for future generations to complete. And so as we close together, I want to repeat the question one more time, and I invite you to hear it in a very deep way. Where in your life is the future calling you beyond current trends, the maps that you know? What possibilities are you sensing that others may not recognize? And are you willing to be the first? What experience wants to emerge through your willingness to venture into unknown territories? The Pathway Pioneer reminds us that innovation isn't about having new ideas, but about accessing the expanded states of consciousness that allows novel connections to emerge. It's about being comfortable with not knowing while maintaining clarity. And it's about trusting that the intelligence of life itself will guide us through uncertainty toward possibilities that we cannot yet imagine. The Pathway Pioneer often needs to access what we'll explore in our next episode, the consciousness of the loving disruptor. Because pioneering new pathways isn't about sensing what wants to emerge. It's also about compassionately challenging the systems that prevent that emergence. Thank you for being with me today. I'm Annie Browning as we explore the 5 leaders of the Great Transition together. Until next time.